All right, so if you go to the landing page for our class and head over to weekly modules, you'll see that I put in week number 2, which is the beginning of our short fiction unit. So there are 3 main sections to this particular, where's my thingy? Let me share my screen. There are 3 main sections to our study this term: short fiction, poetry, and drama. So we'll work on short fiction for a few weeks and then we'll move on to the other units. Probably already figured that out because your assignment was to read some short fiction and read about plot, so that's not a big surprise. Our objectives this week are to develop analytical reading skills using close reading practices to analyze for plot. We're going to talk about that today. I'm going to add to your notes that you took from the textbook. And also another objective is that you will investigate literary periods and movements associated with fiction. I'll talk about that assignment toward the end of the period. If you scroll down to where it says learning activities and assignments, that's our main area for today. I put a little link in here. You won't be able to do it now, but I understand that you might not always want to be on camera. I don't have a choice when I'm teaching the class, but I know that you might not always want to. Sometimes I go to meetings and they make us all put our cameras on at WISD, but sometimes I wish I didn't have it on. So I understand that. If you're not going to have your camera on, then could you use the steps that are here on this link to just put a picture of yourself so that I can start to learn who's who. I want to make sure I know your names so that when we do end up in face-to-face situation, I don't just call you, you know, capital G or whatever was on your square. You can't, I don't think you can do it while you're in a meeting, but you could do it afterwards, just so that whenever you're on pause with your video, your picture's there for me. I appreciate that. Just a reminder that there's a formative for today because we have class. So sometime before the end of the day today, if you haven't already, there are a couple little videos, real short videos, a couple minutes, that about Gloria Alvarez. She wrote the story Snow, which you should have read for today. And she's talking a little bit about her life in those 2 clips. And then the question has to do with, how do you think that her lived experiences in her real life translated to her character of Yolanda that she was able to create in that story? So make sure that you get over to that before the end of the day today so I can mark you present. I also want to mention that there are some assignments that should already have been turned in at this point. So I want to go through them, and that way if something slips through your, attention, you can contact me and see what we can do. I know that the beginning of this is kind of crazy and every instructor has a different thing that they're doing, and I know that it can be confusing. So if you're missing any of these things, then email me or stick around after class and talk to me about it or something, so that I'll know that you're interested in doing something about that grade. The first one is the summer assignment. That should have been submitted on Google. I'm starting to look through those to grade them. The grades will be in this week. You're also supposed to take an academic integrity quiz on Blackboard. So if for some reason that slipped your attention, then email me and I'll see what I can do for you. You should have also submitted your who I am and where I'm going slide and made comments on 5 of your classmates' slides. I think it was really interesting during the course of the week to see people posting their creative sort of like, who I am, where I'm going posters. And it was interesting to see the comments because I think some people found out some things about people that they thought they knew and they didn't know that about them. So it's kind of good to see those connections and see you all say, hey, I didn't know you played the piano, or I didn't know you wanted to be a veterinarian. So it's kind of cool to see that interplay. We'll look at those a little bit briefly today because they really impressed me. Also, there were 2 formatives last week, on Tuesday and on Thursday. Can't really make those up. Those are things that have to be done on that day for attendance. But hopefully, if I contacted anybody who didn't turn in those formatives last week, just to remind them that, it's good to put that on your planner. I put all of the activities and assignments in day order like this so that you can use it with your planner, right? Whatever you use to plan, everything's laid out by the day. So it'd be good to put in on all the B days, you know, go and do your formative sometime before the end of the night. Okay, so the next one is participate in or, okay, so I want to talk about these things today, and the majority of our class period will be talking about these items. I want to go over some of the things that you read for class today, and also give you some additional notes to the textbook on plot. So one of the things that I had you do last week was to look at the syllabus, and I made a little like companion video that goes with it. So hopefully you had a chance to look at that. I want to give you an opportunity right now, if you have a question from the syllabus, or you know, me going over the syllabus with the video, then if you have a question, you can ask me. You can either put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself if there's anything you want me to explain further. Anybody? Okay, well, that was easy enough. I also want to talk about this document that I had you look at today too, interrogating texts. I think this is more of a tool than anything else. A lot of times I notice that students in dual, also in AP, who come to my class, sometimes there's a disconnect between when I say read something and make an assignment and students here read a different way. So I think this document is the closest that I've come to something that explains what I'm looking for you to be doing while you're reading. So when I assigned for you to read Story of an Hour, or read Snow, or read this chapter in the textbook, what's on the screen is what I mean by read. I don't mean pass your eyes over it and sort of think about it. I mean read it, learn it, know it, remember it. So that's a different activity in your mind when you're looking at something. So sometimes students don't do as well as they could in the course because they're reading very quickly and without much depth. And then they'll be like, I don't know why I can't pass these tests. I don't know why I can't pass this quiz. And it's probably because when an instructor says read, they mean all of these things that are on this list and the stuff from the book that we read this summer, right? So I like this document because it gives you some real concrete strategies to use if you forget what you read. If you read something and then 4 days later when you go to class, it doesn't seem familiar when the instructor's talking about it, then that's not good reading. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but you need to improve that before you head off to college, right? So this document has some elements on it to help you boost that, so that the time that you spend reading is valuable time, not wasted time. If you forget what you read and you have to go reread it again, you could have just taken more time the first time around and it would have been about equal, right? So I like that this one has some tips for annotating, some tips for outlining, summarizing. I know that a lot of people look at that and they're like, really? I'm going to go home and read over my notes that I just made today? Yeah, that's how you remember. So it's crucial that we're going to go through a lot of material. There's 2 stories that you read this week, and each one of them is at least 10 pages. So the material is going to start ramping up, and it's going to be hard to remember things. So I gave this to you kind of as a tool to help you. If you read and you remember everything you read and you can think about it deeply, I think that's great. If you need a little help in that area, then this document is something to try some of the tips that are on here. Any questions on here? Anything that you want me to talk about a little bit more from this document? Yeah. Okay, moving right through. Let's look at our slideshow. Probably you haven't had a chance to look at the comments that your classmates made. because the slideshow, I'm the owner of the slideshow, so you're not getting any notifications when people are commenting on your slides, but everybody needed to go through and put 5 comments. So I thought maybe we would take a little bit of time to go through, and you can see the final products that your classmates came up with, and you can read the comments that your classmates put on your slideshow. So why don't you take a couple minutes to look through there. I think they're very creative. I think people really tried to express themselves through that process. And I learned a lot about people and saw some interesting videos and stuff when I was going through there. So take a minute to take a little tour. So I think it's a pretty good collection of students in our class. Hopefully you had a chance to read your comments. And is there anybody who wants to talk about something on their slide? I'm not going to make you, but if there's anybody who wanted to clarify or point something out, anybody? Crickets. Okay, I was really impressed with how well you worked on your slides. So I think it was worth a few minutes of our time to look at them. All right, you were supposed to read and take notes on the section of the textbook called plots. And I want to go through that, and maybe as I go through it, you could check your notes and see what you might want to add. I don't think that the terms that are in this chapter and, the concept of plot is something that's new to you. I don't think that, the terms in this chapter at all are new to you, but I do want to make sure that we can use those terms to analyze and talk about literature instead of using it to identify parts of a story. We want to be able to use it to discuss deeper issues within stories, like we read in the summer book and so on. So I think it's important. I like the way the book puts it here. Anything in bold, you need to make sure that you have a good definition for. Plot is the first one, obviously. And the book says plot is more than what happens, it is how what happens is revealed, the way of arrangement. And an author has a choice in that, right? You can do chronological story, but more often than not, stories don't follow that pattern. So all of that, when a flashback occurs or when there's foreshadowing, all of that is the author's choice. And they're kind of pulling the puppet strings, making the reader follow along in a way that they want their story to be revealed. And it's a craft in that way. So it's important to remember that plot is more than just the events. It's the choices that the author makes as they're going through and creating that experience for us when we read. Kind of like the way a director will film and then cut a film, right? So they might decide to leave one scene out, or they might decide that another scene is better shot a different way. So all those decisions are the same kinds of decisions that authors make when they're writing their works. Conflict, of course, is central to plot. And, really would it be interesting to watch a movie or read a book that didn't have a conflict? Some people sat on a couch. How exciting, right? So there always is going to be a conflict. And when we talk about conflict, we talk about the opposing forces in the text. The textbook has a definition of protagonist as the story's principal character right here. I think that's a good definition. I like to also say it's the character that drives the action. So the character that is pushing things along because they have a goal usually. Usually the protagonist has something to achieve, something to realize, something to find. And so they're pursuing something, and it's their actions that we're following. You need to kind of let go of any preconceived ideas about the morality of a protagonist. When you're younger, I think we teach little kids a protagonist is the good person and the antagonist is the bad person. But in complicated literature, it just doesn't really work out that way. And in life, I'm sure you've realized that there are people mainly in the gray area. Most people are not 100% purely perfect and awesome, and there's not people that are 100%, well, maybe there are, I don't know. But most people fall somewhere in the middle. So the gray area is where we normally see character development. And so the protagonist isn't going to be necessarily good or bad. They're just driving the action of the story. I could have a serial killer as a protagonist in my story. So the antagonist then is not necessarily the bad person, but the antagonist is a bad person to the protagonist, right? Because they're trying to keep them intentionally or unintentionally from achieving their goals. So the antagonist could be, as they point out in the text, someone or something. An emotion can be an antagonist, right? Fear can stop a person from acting. So fear, love, those sorts of things can be antagonistic in a character. Or it could be a person. It could even be the weather, right? The weather could be an antagonist. If somebody's trying to climb a mountain and there's a huge snowstorm, then the snowstorm is the antagonist, right? So it's important to kind of open up your ideas about what is antagonizing that protagonist, and then you'll have probably more to work with in your analysis of a piece of literature. Any questions on that? The conflict section here? Okay. The next part is stages of plot, and I know that you've seen these before. I'm going to switch. I have a cool trick today to show you. You're not going to be impressed, but I'm impressed with myself, so that's all I need. Ooh, document camera time. I set up my phone so that I could have a document camera. I MacGyvered it up. I know that's exciting, right? All right, so when we're talking about plot, I'm just going to kind of go away from the textbook a little bit because I'm sure that you have learned Freytag's pyramid, right? Who has heard of Freytag's pyramid before? Aren't about it? No? Well, you know what it is. I know you know what it is because they've been teaching it to you since you were little. Freytag's pyramid is when we take plot and we make it look like this, right? Now I remember what Freytag's pyramid is. They probably just never called it that. Freytag was a literary theorist, a dramatist actually, and so this is his concept. Now, we use this to talk about plot, and we say, this is all review, I'm sure. So this is exposition, right? The beginning of a story. Then that yields to the rising action, then the climax, the falling action, and the resolution, right? We all know those. Sometimes in your textbook, they call the resolution the denouement. So if you want to be fancy and French and, you know, bougie, as the kids say, you can change your resolution to denouement. I'll probably say resolution because I'm a working class type lady. In any case, this is what we usually diagram out for plot of a story. It's not really how stories work. If you think about it, stories actually are more like this. Doot, doot. Usually the majority of the story is building up to some event, which is climactic. And then there's a little bit of falling action, a little bit of resolution. But this chart makes you think that the climax is going to be in the middle of the story, right? And it's not. It's usually toward the end. So usually it's something more like this, but that's not as easy to diagram out on a piece of paper. So, all right, so let's go through, and you know what? Let's use the story that you read for today, the Julia Alvarez story, Snow, as an example as we go through and talk about these sections of plot and how you can use it to analyze in a deeper way when you are examining a short fiction text. So when we talk about exposition, we mean, you know, kind of like the intro, right? We mean we need to get to know the characters, you know, probably the setting, basic situation. We might be introduced to, you know, like the basic conflict, something like that. In Snow, at the very beginning of that story, as short as it is, we find out that we've got a protagonist named Yolanda. And she's a little girl, right? Yolanda is, I think, in the 4th grade. How old were you when you were in the 4th grade? Like 9? 9 years old, something like that? 8, 9 years old? Little. Well, not little, but you know, young enough that you don't have a lot of life experience. We also find out in the exposition that Yolanda has immigrated to New York City with her family. So that is a new experience for her. She's a first-person narrator. So everything's going to be told through her eyes. We find that out in the exposition. And we also know about setting, right? New York City is the location, but what about time period? Can anybody unmute and tell me about the time period?
It was around the Holocaust.
It's after the Holocaust. It's in the 1960s because we have President Kennedy, right? They're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that happened in the early 1960s. Besides Yolanda, our other character really is that nun, right, that she has as a teacher. Yolanda goes to Catholic school, and her teacher is Sister Zoe. Imagine having nuns for your teachers. I went to Catholic school. I had nuns and priests as my teachers. It's kind of strange. But there weren't very many discipline problems because, you know, how do you act up to a nun? All right, so we have the basic situation, we have the characters, we have the setting that we're all presented in the exposition. The rising action is set up to reflect conflict, right? Rising action is all about conflict. And remember that there can be internal conflict and also external conflict. Can there be more than one type of conflict in a story? What do you think? Chat. Yes, okay. Yes, there can be more than one conflict in a story. As a matter of fact, the more complex the story is, probably the more conflicts will arise. I also think it's good to note that an internal conflict can be caused by an external conflict, right? If there's something going on outside of the protagonist, it can cause them an emotion internally. For example, if we have a character whose parents are always fighting, then maybe that causes feelings of being unsettled or confusion internally in the character, and they're not sure how to act as a result of that. Also, internal conflicts can create external conflicts, right? If somebody is angry or upset on the inside, they could lash out on the outside and create an external conflict. So it's important to remember that these are sometimes reciprocal, and we can see that in characters too, where the internal and the external affect each other. And in life, that's the way it is. You don't just have one conflict that's purely just external to you. We tend to internalize problems and either try to solve them, but then that creates an internal conflict for us, right? So usually these are all mixed up together. In Snow, Yolanda has a couple of conflicts that she's wrestling with, right? Number one is that she's in a new environment. She doesn't really understand it a whole lot. She's got her teacher, Sister Zoe, who sort of pulls her to the side and makes sure that she's close to her so she can help her with the language and with, you know, acquiring the skills that she needs in her new environment. But she needs extra help with that. There's things that she doesn't understand in her new environment. And then also, there's this overall conflict of impending war. This was a real conflict that happened in the 1960s. Maybe you remember from your history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where America was afraid that Cuba, which was a communist country, it was going to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, and then that would cause a war and, you know, cause all kinds of issues. So the kids at Yolanda's school are being sort of drilled about what do you do if there is a air raid siren? What do you do if there is a bomb that gets dropped on the school? And so in the back of their mind, they're always thinking, oh, you know what, this could be happening sometime. You have to teach kids to get under the desks or, you know, hide, or like we do our shooter drills at school. When I was a kid, we had to do tornado drills in the hallway. So these two things are conflicts for her. One is sort of internal and external, right? The new environment is an external thing that's causing her some internal issues. Same thing for the impending war, but probably the most immediate to her is the new environment. When you're 9 years old, you probably deal more with what's immediate to you than what's sort of philosophical about political situation at the time. All right, the text talks about a stage that happens between rising action and climax. I want to make sure that you get it here on your diagram if you're following along and making this diagram, and that is crisis. That might be a new one for you, I don't know. But there is sometimes, not all the time, but there is sometimes an element of plot that we call crisis because it happens and it sort of is the catalyst for the climax. There's something that happens that makes the climax occur. The climax, of course, is the dealing with the conflicts that were presented in the rising action. It may not solve those conflicts, but the climax will have an alteration in those. There'll be some event that happens that makes the conflict shift. Sometimes they'll be solved. In this case, the climax is when Yolanda kind of freaks out because it's snowing, but she doesn't know that it's snow, right? She's so used to hearing about the impending war that she thinks that it's fallout from, you know, a nuclear weapon. So the climax is when Yolanda reacts to the fallout. You know, there's like stuff in the air and she thinks, oh my gosh, the bomb happened, right? What's the crisis that causes that climax in Yolanda? Well, it snowed. Yolanda had never seen snow before, so she sort of jumped to conclusions and thought that it was this war starting. Sometimes people will tell me that the climax is the emotional high point of the story, and it often is, but not always. So I don't like to define it that way because there's also emotional elements usually in the resolution and the falling action. So if you just say it's the most emotional part of the story, I feel like you could be misled sometimes. It has to be the natural working through of the conflicts. Whatever conflicts you identified over here, the climax will be a shift or a solving of those conflicts. So when Yolanda reacts to the fallout, we have the falling action. Falling action is the result or the consequence of the climax. So because this occurred, the falling action occurred. In this case, it's that Sister Zoe explains that it's snow. And she calms down a little bit, Yolanda. The resolution then is sort of like the final moment or message or image. You know, that final vision that the author wants to leave you with. In this case, it's Sister Zoe telling Yolanda about how snowflakes are all unique like people. Which kind of turns the story into something quite nice at the end, because she compares those snowflakes to people. Different definition of snowflakes in the political landscape these days. But she, instead of dealing with the fact that there's this impending possible, you know, nuclear situation, she focuses instead on the natural elements in order to calm Yolanda down. And when I start thinking about that, plus the conflicts that are presented here, I can start thinking about some deeper issues within the story, and one of them is the idea of vulnerability. Sure, I could just label the plot, but if I don't start thinking about the depth of the story, then I'm not going to really have anything to say if I'm asked to write about it. The people are vulnerable because of the impending war. Yolanda is vulnerable because of her new environment and not understanding certain elements of her new situation. So I can apply that to the story as a whole, that topic, right? And it goes right back to the conflicts. Both represent that. There's a paper in that, right? So the idea of coming up with a concept, it doesn't have to be, I'm not saying that the only thing you can get out of the story is vulnerability. I'm saying it made me think that. I can know if I'm on a good track on my analysis if whatever I come up with as an idea is sort of echoed throughout the entire piece. If I can look back and I can say, well, I see vulnerability all over the place in here, looking back, then I'm probably on a good path of analysis. If I say, oh, this story is all about fear, maybe mildly so, but I don't think it comes through as fear. I think it comes through more as vulnerability. It'd be easier for me to prove that pulling out passages if I was writing, like a 3-page paper or something. So questions about the process that I went through here. I'm hoping that what happened is that you recalled these terms and this shape, this pyramid, but the way that we went through it might have been deeper than you have done in the past. So I think that if you wanted to, you could practice that by doing the same thing for Story of an Hour, right? Story of an Hour has a plot. So you could say, okay, well, what happens in the exposition? What happens in the rising action? The climax. Sometimes it's easier to figure out what the climax is, what the conflict is, and then the climax, and then work back. Work back this way and work back this way. What do you think the climax is in the Story of an Hour? Anybody have an idea about that?
I think it's when she has relief that her husband died.
Yeah.
She feels happy about it.
Yeah, I think it's like that freedom that she starts to feel as she's alone in her room and she's dealing with the fact it's a surprising thing for us because we don't realize immediately that she probably didn't even like her husband, but that freedom is the climax. So if you want a little bit of practice, you could go and kind of try to diagram that out. The way that this sort of thing shows up in a grade for you is that down the line I'm going to give you a test, exam, whatever, and I'm going to give you a new story and ask you to explain maybe something like, how do the variety of conflicts in this story affect the climax? Well, you're going to have to be able to identify them and then discuss how that happens. So the more practice you can get at that, the more proficient you'll be when it comes time to do an exam, a test, a quiz, whatever. So I'm not going to have you, turn in a diagram like this for Story of an Hour. I'm just going to suggest that if you feel like you need to practice that, you could do that. And as long as on the test, you could execute something like I just described, then you're good. Right? So we have to use these tools to on something new. That's how that's going to work. All right, let me go back to the text. The stages of plot, I think I just covered all of those. Order and sequence is the last section. So really the only two terms that they have in this section are flashback and foreshadowing. And I know that you're familiar with those terms as definitions. Flashback is, both of them are rearranging of the chronological order of a story, and authors do that on purpose. So one of the things I want you to avoid in this class is saying things like, oh, the author put that flashback in to make it interesting. That is not why an author does anything. An author doesn't put in imagery to make it, to spice it up, right? What you're really telling me if you say that is, I don't know why the author did that. I guess to make it more interesting, because it was boring to me until then. The reason that an author uses flashback is to fill in the blanks. So make a note next to your notes on flashback. The reason an author uses flashback is to go back and fill in blanks. So maybe we've got a super angry character, and we don't know why for the first quarter of the story or half of the story. We don't know why they're so angry, but they're lashing out and they're upset. Maybe at a crucial time, the author decides to deploy a flashback moment to explain why our character is so angry. Maybe there was an event in that character's past that created that anger that he just hasn't been able to let go of. So flashback is not about, making it more interesting for the reader. Flashback is a function of revealing something about the text or about the character or about the storyline. All right, same thing foreshadowing. The tricky thing about foreshadowing is you don't really recognize foreshadowing until you're done reading the story. For example, in Story of an Hour, in the first sentence or two, we know immediately that Mrs. Mallard has a heart condition. We kind of forget about that because her husband dies and she has her, moment in her room and all that stuff. But then at the very end, she dies of a heart attack out of the surprise of actually seeing her husband come through the door, which is a reversal in the story and, kind of shocking. But then we realized, oh yeah, she had a heart condition. They were treating her really, really like she was fragile. They were being really delicate with her. They were worried about telling her that her husband died because she might have a, heart attack or something like that. So foreshadowing is only recognized in, really at the end. But the purpose of foreshadowing is usually suspense. So, I don't know if you've ever watched, well, you've watched horror movies, right? At the beginning, the kids are in the car and they're going to the beach or whatever. And on the radio in between songs comes on, oh, hey, there's a crazy lunatic that just escaped from the mental asylum. Oh, ha, 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 let's go get some beer. And the kids are, like on their way to the beach. Guess what? Lunatic shows up and kills them all. So foreshadowing is usually something that's hanging over the story to create suspense because we're wondering how that's going to play out later on. And authors will craft that in order to create that suspense. Is suspense a way to keep people reading and keep them interested? Yes, but that's not the reason why the author does it. The author does it to create that sense of suspense. Right. So I guess what I'm saying is there are deeper purposes to everything, not just superficial ones. I think that's the end of the chapter on plot. There's a little chart that comes afterwards. I think the one in your book looks a little bit different, but they put this in because what if your instructor tells you, oh, hey, write a 5-page paper about the plot of some story? Then you have some things that you can ask yourself. I would usually give you more guidance than that in a topic, but they will, these questions here help you think about plot and conflict. Is there anything about this little chapter that you have more questions about that I can go into for you? Okay, I feel like I did D and E here because we talked a lot about the plot elements in Snow because we did the notes on Freytag's pyramid. And I brought in a little bit of Story of an Hour and challenged you to do a plot layout of your own to see, how well you could do that. I want to talk a little bit about the assignments for this week. Thursday, of course, you have the asynchronous formative to do. That's a given. This week, I want you to start working on a timeline that's going to pretty much take you the semester to complete. It's not that it's all encompassing and it's like a huge task. It's just that there are parts on it that are for fiction, parts for poetry, and parts for drama. So I want you to start putting in the fiction parts this week. And then in a few weeks when we work on poetry, you'll add in the poetry parts. And then when we do drama, you'll add in the drama parts, if that makes sense. I'd rather do it like that. I could make the assignment in November and have you turn it in December, but usually there are papers, exams, projects all that stuff going on. So to me, it makes more sense to do it in pieces as we go through the different genres of literature. So if you click on that one, it's pretty straightforward. Doesn't matter to me if you do an electronic or a handwritten timeline, but I want you to imagine that literature's been written for many centuries, fiction, poetry, and drama. And I want you to ultimately, by the end of the semester, create a continuum of the major movements of time periods through literary history. For fiction, there are just three that you need to know: realism, modernism, and postmodernism. You can find descriptions and explanations of those on these pages in your textbook. I think that's the easiest place to start. You can also research online if you want to. I put a couple of resources down here at the bottom that you might want to use. You don't have to. I also put some links here about in case you wanted to do an online timeline, if that's easier for you. Then there are some timeline creators where it puts it in for you, and you just have to, fill in the blanks on the template. But your job is to identify the dates of the period. So you're going to start with realism, and you say, okay, well, realism, when did that even happen with fiction? What are the basic qualities? How do we know we're looking at a realist piece? What about examples of that type of literature? What are some works that fall into that period and movement? And who are some writers that are key important writers from that movement? So, and then you'll put that on the timeline. So say I have a timeline that goes from ancient to 2020. Then I'm going to figure out through my research where on that continuum is realism. And I'm going to put it, there's probably like a range of years, right? So I'm going to put that on the timeline, and then above it, below it, somewhere, I'm going to put in A, B, C, and D up here so that I can identify what realism is. So when was it, and what are the basics about it? Then I move on and find out, okay, what's modernism? When was that? What do they mean when they say something's a modernist piece? Who are the authors that wrote in that time period? And so all that stuff can go on your timeline. And the other one is postmodernism. There's only three for this week. When we get to poetry, there are a few more, so we'll add in. When we get to drama, there are a few more, so that you end up with a timeline at the end. Does that make sense? So the only ones you need to do for this week are the fiction ones here. Are there any questions about that one? I put a due date of Sunday, but maybe I should put a sentence on here. I'm not really collecting it on Sunday because it's not done until we do the other two sections. I just thought Sunday's a good target day because this other stuff's due on Tuesday. So, but you don't have to turn anything into me on Sunday. I'll try to remember to go back in and put a comment there so that that's clear. All right, the other things for this week is some more reading. So I want you to read about character and setting. Next week, on Tuesday, I'll probably do something similar to what I did today, going through the text, seeing if there's any clarification that I can do for you, taking those ideas of character and setting and deepening them and looking for meaning in text. We may do some breakout room activities where you work with the two stories for this week in terms of character and setting. So I might set you up in a group of 4 and have you discuss. So that means you need to read these two stories. They are much longer than this week's stories. I kind of gave you a break on the first week and gave you some really tiny stories. These are a little bit longer. I would say that they're probably, I haven't counted the pages, but probably 10 pages each. Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison and 56 to 0 by T.C. Boyle. I want you to read those two stories so that we can work on character and setting next week. When you're reading, you can focus on, obviously, character and setting because we're studying it this week, but also plot, kind of keep adding to your ability to look at short fiction by running it through plot and character development and setting as we practice all of those different topics. So are there any questions about the assignments for this week that I can help you with before we go? No?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Well, just remember that every day from 2:45 until 4, all of us teachers are available. You can message me at my Google Voice number. I think I gave that to you. It's somewhere. It's on the main page, the Start Here page. If you go to the Start Here, I think it's there. You can message me there. You can email me. Yeah, this is my Google Voice, 332-2392. You can message me there. You can email me. I'm pretty good at responding. So if something comes up, just let me know. All right. I always like to finish in about an hour. I feel like that's a good amount of time. Do you want me to go on? I just would be repeating myself. I got the job done already. I got the job done clocking out. No, I'm not going to clock out. I have until 4. All right, I'm going to sign out of the meeting then. If something comes up, then just let me know. I hope you all have a good week. Good to see you all. Take care.
Bye, miss. Have a good day.
Bye, you too.
Bye, miss.
Bye. Josiah, did you have a question?